Welcome, Professor Glenda Sluga from the EY History Department and Robert Schuman Centre. It's a pleasure to have you here today. So in 2020, you were awarded the ERC grant for the project 20th Century International Economic Thinking and the Complex History of Globalization, ECOIN, which raises very important questions about the role of women in the history of international economic thinking. Why focus specifically on women? What does examining their contributions reveal about them, about economic history, and also about the world we live in today?
Well, thank you very much for having me today to talk about this, because I think it's a very important topic. I think at the moment we're finding there's a bit of a backlash actually against singling out any particular group or kind of person in history, and yet women's history has been around now for about half a century as a really strong field. And even though I'm not really in women's history, I'm really interested in the ways in which looking at different sites of politics in the past reveals that women have been much more active and contributed much more to how we think and what we do than we have realised. And if you think about some of those movies about women who helped, the first moonshot, or were behind the scenes in coding during the Second World War, we're discovering more and more that women have been part of really important moments in history. And so the question becomes, why haven't we noticed them? And what happens when we do notice them?
So were there any particular women in this history that stood out to you specifically, and what made them especially interesting or significant?
Well, I'm a historian of the 20th century and the 19th more generally, and when one looks at those 200 years overall, what's really noticeable is that the history of modernity goes in two directions. It goes forward as different groups get more and more rights, but actually much of the history of democracy in the 19th century is really about particular groups of people getting rights and a kind of separating off of women and non-white groups in particular. And so women don't get a lot of political rights, they don't have rights in the workplace that are the same as men's until much later in the 20th century overall. And what's interesting about international organisations, which I study, is that you find that women who can't get jobs in modern nation states for much of the 19th and the 20th century do find jobs in international organisations in the 20th century in ways that they wouldn't back home. So international organisations such as the League of Nations in the first half of the 20th century and then the UN become very important places for women who do go to university, get into university. Sometimes they can't take degrees, but they study in certain fields, including economics or in law or in social welfare, for example. And they find that international organisations like first the League of Nations and then its successor, the UN, are places that they can apply for jobs. There are new studies that show that they sort of get stopped, there's a glass ceiling, but nevertheless, that they are able to contribute to the larger projects of these organisations in ways that they can't necessarily back home. So I find that fascinating, and it's a byproduct of the fact that I study international organisations that I realise that women are there, and you can see much more of individual women that you wouldn't notice, but also what difference having women there as a group make to the kinds of subjects that get studied by these organisations and the kinds of work they do, in fact.
Thank you for your response. That's a very interesting perspective. So thinking about how does incorporating women's perspectives reshape our understanding of both the past and the present?
I mean, that's a harder one to prove in some senses, but I do think there are two things. And one is very basic. And you say, well, women were there and we just haven't seen them, right? They're there. In the case of international organisations, they're lobbying, but they're also working in different kind of departments, including ones that are thinking about economic policy on a global scale. And they're thinking about what kinds of interventions can be made by international organisations to fix things that don't work. In particular, through the 20th century, there's a body called the International Labour Organization, or the ILO. It still exists, it's in Geneva. And that becomes a particularly important place for women to participate in improving labour standards for women, but also other groups. But questions about women's equal wages, about the kind of hours they can work, the kinds of jobs they're allowed to do, those get debated and argued in these sites, and often because women are in them, working there. Incorporating women into development programs in the 20th century. So development becomes a really important policy area for international organisations in the 20th century as an attempt to fix some of the wrongs of imperialism of the 19th. And in that context, it's really not until women are employed by these organisations that they begin to notice actually that when you do development, you have to think about the ways in which in different kinds of communities labour is organised, unofficial, official, taking women into account when you do different kinds of surveys of what's important in an economy, what kind of work women do versus what work men do in different cultures, etc. So having women in these organisations often meant that women got noticed globally much more. On the other hand, I think there's also a non-specific to women sort of contribution, and that is that in a number of studies that have taken place of the difference women make in these bodies, sometimes it's about the kinds of the extent of thinking about the economy that gets incorporated into the work of these international organisations. So we have a much broader spectrum of ideas about social justice, for example, or about what the goal of economic policy is. Should it be about making sure that trade works better or markets work better? Or should it be about thinking about what trade and markets are for? Are they for making people's lives better? So how do you make sure that happens? And so it's not that only women work in those areas or add those kinds of ideas, or that women only add those kinds of ideas, but you do find by looking for women that you see much more of that going on, actually.
And, looking at today and let's say our current also political context and situation. So, recently, especially in the US, we've seen certain funding agencies, have discouraged the use of the word woman in grant applications. This brings up an interesting point related to, how we think of the future of studying women in history. What does that mean today?
Well, it's really worrying, isn't it? Because as it is, it's often hard to get some mainstream areas accepting that it's important to look at women or they make a difference, you sort of add it on or not, but actually understanding the difference women have made, but also why they haven't been incorporated allows you to understand all sorts of other hidden inequalities in societies, or hidden or not so hidden actually. So taking women out doesn't remove the fact that they're there, or that they were there, but it makes it less likely that it's a legitimate topic of discussion or understanding. And in my case, it would mean not seeing so much about how international organisations have worked, the range of economic thinking that has taken place in those bodies. So it would give me a distorted sense of the past. So to not see women is actually to be more ideological in a way, and to not see the past as it really was. So I think in that sense, it's not a great thing. But, and I think that's why it's important to keep emphasising that looking for women is a really important part of a broader project in terms of understanding the political past and what happened in the past.
Right, to be able to also look forward. Right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I can give you some specific examples of women and the kinds of contributions if you think that would be helpful for understanding. So, it depends where you look, but there's a woman called Edith Penrose who was born American. She studied in the United States and California. She studied economics, and at a very young age, she had a child. Her husband died, and she was invited to go and work in the League of Nations. And so she went there and became part of a unit researching how, during the First World War, Britain actually used government central planning in order to make sure the population was fed. And so it was really a study of how governments can make sure that there's more equal distribution of food and more efficient distribution of food. So rather than just letting markets rule what role governments can play. And it was that way that she became part of a broader project within various parts of the UN that she worked for a while, in thinking about how the world, kind of inequality in the world, and how you might use planning to kind of improve the distribution of food to different parts of the world. But she'd been trained in America by a quite conservative economist for her PhD. So people often think that, without even reading her, oh, well, she was quite conservative. But she wasn't. She was really open to thinking about different ways of organising economies. And then the really important contribution she made, her name's Edith Penrose, was that she ended up getting a job in Baghdad, setting up an economics department with her husband, Ernest. And while she was in Baghdad, she decided that she couldn't understand how oil companies worked and how they made all their money and what they did on the ground in places like Iraq, because oil companies were multinationals at that time. And so she and another woman, a journalist of petroleum studies, in fact, went around sort of trying to get into these oil companies to understand how they operated. And it was on that basis that Penrose worked out that oil companies were actually, or these multinationals, were using their position in different countries to work out how they could minimise their tax, for example, or how they could use different sites to do different parts of the work of producing petroleum and selling it, etc., and refining it. And on that basis, that's how international firms worked. And it meant that, she could understand why certain countries got less or more benefit out of having these multinationals there running the oil business. And this was in a time when, in fact, there was a lot of concern about multinational companies and the kinds of political influence they had in the Middle East and in Latin America. So it was Edith that came up with these theories, and I think that part of it was the fact that she had been, her experience had come out of these international organisations where she had a global view of the world. And I think most of the women that I've looked at who ended up becoming, relatively well known in economic thinking, the way they saw the world was different because of their experience in international organisations too. They would argue that they saw the world as it is. They saw that it wasn't an idealised marketplace, that there were these inequalities depending if you were in the global north or global south, if you were a man or a woman, etc. So, seeing the world as it is was a really important contribution, I think, to broadening our understanding of economies and how they work.
Right, exactly. I think those are really useful and fact-specific examples also to see, kind of the smaller in the larger context, right? And opening up also the conversation now a bit more related, in fact, to your ERC project. How did your interest start for this project? What is it? Could you explain, give a little bit more detail of it as a whole?
Often, it's really interesting. As an historian, I have terrible memory. And I often think, how did I end up doing this?
Yeah.
I think in the first place, I started looking at international organisations. It's quite a while ago now. I can't even remember when. It's more than 20 years ago. And I think it was because I knew someone who worked at the UN, and I was visiting The Hague, and I thought, oh, this is interesting. What happens here? And I'd been working more on nationalism. And once I started looking at international organisations, I realised they were so interesting and unique. And I think more and more they're so characteristic of the 20th century. And in that sense, they're very different from the our 21st century is different from the 20th. We've got a lot of the things, the institutions and ideas that carried over, even from the Enlightenment, etc., all being challenged, of course, now. But international organisations were so characteristic of the 20th century that I think it's important to remember to include them in our understanding of the 20th century and to see how different it was, the 20th century from now, in terms of valuing some form of cooperation between nations on this international level. Now, there's all sorts of complications in that history, so we understand the extent to which it was, international organisations were kind of set up by great powers often. But actually, when you look from below, when you look at women or colonial groups, etc., what we call the subaltern sort of populations, you see that they became really important political sites for change in the 20th century, as well as, people had all sorts of motivations up and down the level of of places like the UN and the League for what it might do, and the expectations and ambitions were often let down, but at the same time there was always this understanding that you had to think about how to solve major problems. That peace was important, so how do you get there? That social justice on a global scale might be important, how do you get there? That somehow moral questions should define in some way the ways in which states work and their relationships with each other. And I think that is harder to get at these days. And it's what makes understanding and remembering the 20th century so important. So that's why I'm there now. That's why I find it still so interesting to understand also all its complexities, but to think about and really get at and understand what people thought they were doing when they established these bodies, when they worked in them, why they became more or less popular at different moments in the 20th century. I often think to the 1970s. One of my most interesting case studies at the moment is the 1970s, when some economists, including a woman called Barbara Ward, started talking about the importance of imagining the world in planetary terms. Now, right now, we do have a kind of interest in the planetary as a way of solving our existential problems with climate change, with the sort of geopolitical issues that we have, that we need to think about really everything we do from a planetary perspective, not a national one, not even a global one. But in the 70s, that was already around, and people who talked about planetary said that, this is a perspective, okay, you see the world suddenly from outer space, we never saw it before, we can see the Earth, but it wasn't just that. Planetary politics was also about, having priorities in terms of what mattered more or less. And in that sense, there was a lot of questioning about, prioritising markets over people, or, deciding what was important, what kind of economy would work in a way that meant that it was fairer, but also, dealt with challenges to the environment of industrialisation and capitalism. So in that sense, it's super interesting to see all the ideas people had and why they argued them. And a lot of this came out of international organisations and the kinds of conferences they had. But it also disappeared, right? And it was replaced with globalisation and the idea of sustainability. And like, oh yeah, we can make compromises, it'll be fine. So what happened? First of all, why did those ideas arise? And then why did they disappear? And what might have happened if we'd kind of continued down that path of really thinking hard about what needed to happen in order to solve the larger problems the world was facing then, which have become much worse now, of course, unfortunately.
More on a personal note as well, because you mentioned your interest and what really sparked this interest in the project itself. Would you say, on more of a personal note, what would make this topic close to your heart? Is there a specific angle or something about it that speaks really to you personally?
Well, I think most of us are concerned about the world at the moment, and we all want what we do to matter. And I've often thought, history really does matter. You see people talking about history in all sorts of contexts to justify all sorts of things. But if we don't think hard about history, it's like having dementia. It's like walking around going, you've no anchor, no way of orientating yourself. So personally for me, it's really about making what I do at an everyday level matter in some way, to understand the past better, but also to think about how I can tell historical stories about the past that I've discovered in ways that, that make a difference to how people think about themselves, their lives and the world, and what opportunities there are to change it.
In today's context, of course.
That's pretty ambitious, but
I know,
that's
right?
something to drive us.
No, but it's in fact very important to assess the past in order to apply it to how our world functions today too.
I would agree with that. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Professor Glenda Sluga from the History Department and Robert Schuman Centre, for being here with us today. It was a great pleasure to have you.
Thank you for spending the time with me, actually. Thank you.